I'm working on this premise that school is a game. And amazingly enough, this is a real game, School Tycoon. When I had it up on my screen, my son walked in the room and he said, "That has got to be the most boring, stupid idea I've ever heard of in my life." And indeed, there is a book out called The Game of School. And Robert Fried, the author of that book, defines the game of school as a paralysis of intellect and meaningful inquiry, which is a rather pessimistic approach. And quite honestly, the question of whether school is a game or whether it should be a game depends in large part on what your definition of a game is. The author, Jane McGonigal, who is a game designer, has talked about a lot of the negative language we use for games. This is not a game, it's serious. Or you're gaming the system, that sort of thing. And she has a much more positive outlook relative to games. And she uses this definition for a game. It actually was coined by Bernard Suits, but I came across it through Jane McGonigal's work. A game is something that has a goal, rules, feedback, and voluntary participation. If you use this definition of a game, then indeed school is already a game, and it has been from the beginning. The question is the structure of this game optimal in terms of getting our students to learn? And we're going to explore that a bit, and the main premise that we're going to be working on is this one, that the game of school and the rules and the structure that we have in this game were designed around scarce resources. It's a 100-year-old game, roughly, public education, 150 years, depending on where you look. And it was designed to optimize the use of scarce resources. But the technology that we have available to us today replaces scarcity with abundance in a number of different areas. There are remaining areas, such as teacher time, where scarcity will remain and continue. But we can reallocate those scarce resources by applying abundance in a lot of different areas. And that is the thesis that we're going to see throughout my presentation. So to get into that, I'm going to talk about a few technologies. This is kind of dipping our feet in. We're not going to jump deep into the technologies because we could spend an entire conference on that. But I'm going to dip my feet into the technologies that we're working on at the Gates Foundation and that a number of other people are working on. And then we're going to get into this game of school and see how the structure of that game could be adjusted to take advantage of these resources and have a much greater impact in the learning of our students. So if you look at, we're going to go back to Microeconomics 101 for hopefully only a couple of seconds. But I think most people recognize the supply and demand curves and the equilibrium price. This is what we were all taught. We have scarcity in the production, and as a result, the cost of each individual good goes up. This is really interesting because it's completely different from what they teach you in home economics, where buying in bulk costs less and so more is less. But in fact, when you have scarce resources, the marginal cost of goods somewhere along the way does climb on that curve. The marginal value to the next buyer goes down, and we get to this equilibrium price, right? The digital world is entirely different, and I don't think economists have really gotten into this yet. The first item developed can cost quite a bit. Gary Lopez, who developed under a grant from us in the Hewlett Foundation this really amazing mathematics course, spent about $1.5 million on the development and production of that course. Unit 1 cost $1.5 million. Unit 2 costs less than a penny, all right? And it goes from there. And so the economics are entirely different. That marginal cost curve that used to go up drops to 0 on number 2 and stays essentially flat. That's a whole different world in economics. And in fact, it causes such heartache to the people who are producing creative goods that they have to put in things that create artificial costs where there weren't real costs previously. We have things like digital rights management and all these kinds of things. And to handle that border between the abundance of digital goods and the fact that the people who produce those digital goods still need to have a roof over their heads and still need to eat food and consume things that remain scarce in our economy. We could spend an entire conference talking about this and what do we do about that border. I'm just going to acknowledge that the border exists And for the case of education, we can take advantage of the fact that those digital goods can be just as abundant as we care to make them. In order to access this digital abundance, we've got to make some assumptions. The students need to have some kind of computing device to work with. The schools need to be equipped with sufficient bandwidth to make use of it. We have a hope that the homes are equipped with bandwidth as well, but in the populations that we as a foundation deal with, and many of you also deal with, that's not necessarily a guarantee. So we may have to make sure that the bandwidth that's necessary is in the school at least. And you've got to have technical support. You've got to replace broken devices. You've got to replace your equipment and upgrade it at a regular basis. Costs for this vary between $400 and $600 per student year. On top of that, you've got to do some professional development, which quite honestly is considerably more expensive than this, and you have to make some differences. Again, we could spend a lot of time on this. For now, we're just going to acknowledge that those requirements exist. Assuming that we've taken care of that part, that we've provided the students with the devices, the access, the bandwidth they need, we get this abundant content. And it's really interesting to see what's happening with the abundance of content. And if you look on the internet, nearly everything's there, right? There's resources from NASA, from Wikipedia, from YouTube videos that may be useful in your class. And there are sites who have gone out there and said, let's collect that information. We've got OER content repositories and so on that are collecting this information, trying to curate it for the sake of the teachers. But we're in the nascent stage. The reality is we have an embarrassment of abundance or a problem. It's the needle in the haystack problem, which is why I have the haystack on the screen. Where's the first place, those of you who are teachers in this room, where's the first place you go when you're looking for content for your class? Is it Google? Google, yeah. You go to Google first. You don't go to Hippocampus. You don't go to, I just learned about a new one a couple days ago, and I've even forgotten its name already. We have Curriki, there's Connections, there's all these different OER repositories, and yet we all go to Google first, right? So I was playing around with Google AdWords the other day, and this is where you can put in keywords and find out what people are searching for. And I put in the word fractions. In the last month, 135,000 people searched for subtracting fractions. So I'm presuming these are probably students looking for some help. 201,000 people searched for fractions worksheet. So I'm presuming these are teachers looking for something, right? Now here's the great one. 368,000 people searched for fraction to decimal. Now, how hard is it to convert a fraction into a decimal? Your computer can do it, right? The tool you've got in front of you that you're searching Google for can do this. What that indicates to me is a failure, right? We failed to educate people on the relationship between decimals and fractions because they're out there searching for this. So we go to Google for this information. And as a result, as we were strategizing, what can we do to grant greater access to this information to students and teachers? We came up with this idea. And it's based on this example. We're using pumpkin pie as our example. I usually use potato salad. If you go to Google and you search for pumpkin pie, you'll get this interesting search bar on the left-hand side showing you common ingredients that go into pumpkin pie, and you can say, yes, no, I don't want maple syrup or half and half in my pie. I want it to be a little different from that, but I love cloves and ginger, and whipped cream obviously has got to go on top. And so you can actually check those boxes and narrow your search for a pumpkin pie recipe according to those parameters and how much time you have to cook with, what ingredients are in your cupboard. Wouldn't it be great if a teacher who searched for fractions worksheet had this bar that showed up on the left and said, what's your target grade for this? Are you looking for a lesson plan or are you looking for a video? How long do you have to spend on this? Do you have a student with certain disabilities that needs special accessibility supports on the particular learning activity? That's the kind of thing that we would like to see. Now, conveniently, Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft got together. The reason these recipes work is because Google published a metadata standard that said, here's how to mark up your recipes so that we can do a detailed search on them. So here's how to say these are the ingredients, here's how to say this is the cooking time. And then they acknowledge that markup and they index it. So we said, okay, wouldn't it be nice then if we can show people how to mark up their learning materials so that these search engines can index them and scaffold the searches that the students and teachers are making out there? Conveniently, about the time we were thinking about this, Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft got together and they said, we need a common metadata standard, not one for Google, one for Yahoo, one for Microsoft. And they published this specification called schema.org, and they said, they reached out, they said, if you can represent an industry consortium, tell us what the additional metadata should be to represent your industry. So we got this group of people together. We're called the Learning Resource Metadata Initiative, and it is specifying the tags that you can use to mark up your content. Publishers of content can use to mark it up so that we can say, okay, here's your target audience. It's students in this grade with these particular disabilities or these particular abilities. It's intended to be delivered through a teacher as a learning resource, or it's intended as a direct-to-student option. And here's the licensing available to it and so forth. And so we're putting that together. The LRMI consortium is working hard on this and will be delivering a completed spec at the beginning of next year, and then working with schema.org for that to be adopted. This is going to make a huge difference, we believe, in the ability for us to find and locate materials. You can find more about that at lrmi.net. The next area that I'm going to talk about is this idea of learning maps. Again, we're going back to Google. Let's face it, Google has done a pretty good job in areas outside of education. Hopefully we can move this into education. So if I go to Google Maps, I can zoom in and get down to the street level. Right here we're looking at downtown Seattle and the Gates Foundation, where I spend my work. You can zoom down to the street level. You can zoom out and see where that is relative to the city, to the state, or to the entire world. And then you can mash this up. You can get onto Foursquare and it'll show you where your friends are. You can do a search for coffee shops and it'll show you where those are all laid out on this map. So this map becomes a reference plane where all of this other data can be mashed up into there. So what if we can do the same thing for learning? A lot of talk has been made about the state core standards, and now we've got the common core state standards. What if we, instead of having that be in some book that's published that's on the shelf of the curriculum buyer for the state, and all of the publishers are aware of it because they know they've got to comply with these standards in order to deliver things to the state, what if we were able to take those standards and make them into a map that the students and the teachers were able to interact with directly? And they're looking at this, they're saying, okay, I understand my trajectory. Here's where what I'm learning is in context with my overall career, of my school career, my learning career, right? And hopefully my professional career following that. And I can drill into that and say, okay, this is my high school framework. This is my math course. This is the individual unit that I'm on. Here are the learning objectives that I'm working on. And by the way, I'm struggling with this learning objective. Where are my friends right now? Hey, John has already mastered this one. I can go to him for help. What kind of learning resources? We can link that back then to the LRMI initiative. You can click on something and say, show me videos that are aligned to this particular learning objective to help me learn this. The teacher can go onto the learning map and say, show me my class, and it all lights up and it shows you where the individuals of your class are positioned within the learning map. So we have actually commissioned the development of a learning map system. It's going to be an open source project. It's raw technology that needs to be packaged up. Application developers out there, we need this to be packaged and embedded into other applications and mashed up with all of that other data that we can have. The framework is that this becomes then the game board for school, right? This is where I go to say, here's where I am, here's where I'm progressing. This is the feedback to the student at a very high level as well as a detailed level of what's going on. And it can give purpose to the students so that they're not lost in this, I'm attending school and you're delivering education to me, but they're involved in this journey, literally, of finding and learning and growing, and they're able to view that on there. So we're really excited, actually, about this learning map technology, and we're hoping that other people will adopt the metaphor as well. The final piece of technology that I'm going to talk about is assessments. Who's a believer in assessments and the data that we get from assessments, right? If without that data, we don't know what we're supposed to do next in class. We can try, and I'm going to talk a lot more about feedback in a few minutes when we get into the game of school. But the problem with assessments is that they're expensive. They're expensive to compose. They're expensive to administer to the class, to get the score back, to interpret those scores and decide what we should do about it. And that is due to, and because they're expensive to do all these things, assessments are relatively scarce. And the feedback is weak that we get from them. Okay, mathematics is taught by giving homework exercises every night. And we know that actually that's a fairly well-proven way of learning mathematics is do your exercises, or at least the procedural fluency piece of mathematics. Mathematical thinking is a different world, but you've got to have that fluency before you can start the mathematical thinking. And so we assign exercises every evening. Student does the exercise, turns in the homework, a day later gets the homework back. In many cases, you did your homework, great, you got credit, whether they were right or not. If the teacher has a little bit more time or is more dedicated, then the teacher is going to actually grade that, that mathematics assignment and say, you know what, you're really having trouble, you're not understanding this. But that's, you're 2 units past that by the time the feedback actually reaches the student. And so we have these assessment systems that take a lot of teacher time to use, and yet the feedback remains weak. So we've got this problem here with assessments being literally scarce. So what if we had abundant assessment? What would happen? What if we had large online question banks and you could say, I've got these 5 learning objectives, I need a quiz based on them? What if a student could go in there and say, hey, I want to know if I understand this or not. Help me out with this a little bit. What if we could automatically compose, administer, and score these assessments and give rich feedback to the students? Now, I'm not under the illusion that we can automate the scoring of an essay. Some people think that we can do that, and in fact, there's pretty effective systems when you're doing large summative assessments. But when you're in the learning moment and a student submits an essay, there's little to substitute for the teacher that says, I like your thesis statement, but it's not well supported in paragraph 2. Why don't you edit that a little bit? What we can do, though, in an automated form is say, it gives them some basic grammar feedback. Your punctuation and your capitalization is correct. Your sentences are a bit run on. Why don't you fix those a little bit? So that we can get that first round of feedback to the student and optimize the teacher feedback for things that humans only can do. So we actually have an abundant assessment initiative. It's still in the concept stage, but we expect to launch something early in the next year that again is going to be an open framework working with the OER repositories in such a way that we can make abundant assessments available to teachers in conventional classrooms, to online courses, and whatever other framework that you might be able to have. All of this fits together in something we call the personalized learning model. And this is based on the idea that the education needs to be adapted to the needs of each individual student. And in order to do that, we need to assist the teacher. The teacher doesn't have sufficient capacity to individualize the education for every student without some help. But I think that the digital abundance offers us that ability. And so we center on these learning objectives. We've got our student data, we've got our content, we've got our assessments, and it all fits together in this lovely feedback loop. And this is great for technologists, right? This is how we figure out how to assess or to organize our technologies. But in the last few months, I've been thinking about what does that mean for the school itself? Is this going to make a difference without us adjusting the structure, the way we teach, the way we structure the school? And the answer is no, it really isn't. This is raw technology. We can't just take school, add technology, everything's wonderful. There are changes, there are adjustments that have to be made. And so we take this technology on the left and we take this game of school on the right with these goals, these rules, feedback, and voluntary participation. We say, how do these things fit together? So let me talk for a minute about this framework of games, and let's exercise this framework a little bit, the goal, the rules, the feedback, voluntary participation. Right? So let's do it with a familiar game, Monopoly. The goal is to bankrupt all the other players. Rules are toss the dice, move around the board, get $200, pay rent. We have a feedback system. At any point in time, you know how much money you've got in front of you. You can sort of glance around and peek at the other people's money, see how they're doing. You've got your pieces in various positions and so forth. And the game lasts as long as everybody is enjoying it and they're voluntarily participating, right? One of my elementary school favorites was British Bulldog. You go out on the field, everybody lines up on one side except whoever's it. You're in the safe zone until the guy who's it yells British Bulldog, and then the safe zone moves to the other side of the field. You have to get across without being tackled. Again, in each of these cases, we have a rule, or a goal, rules, some feedback, know how you're doing, and voluntary participation in the game. Now, as we think about games, Jane McGonigal, again, referring back to her and who gave us this structure, she started looking at the games and the people who spend their time in these World of Warcraft or other games online and said, why are they spending so much time in the games and so little time in the real world? And the answer, in her opinion, was that reality is broken. The rewards, the feedback that we get in these games is missing in the real world. And her suggestion is, let's not call games bad waste of time. Let's see what we can learn from those, and let's see if we can change reality in such a way that it has the same kind of rewards, the same kind of structure, the same kinds of things that make that engaging that the games have. And so I'm going to see if we can apply that to our school here, and that's the exercise for the balance of our session. So looking at the school, we have a goal. It's to graduate. We have rules, go to class, participate at some minimal level. We have feedback in the form of grades, and we have voluntary participation, at least until students drop out. But despite this framework, many students actually follow the rules. They behave well, they show up in class, they even get advanced, but there's a pretty high rate of failure to learn even if you succeed in gaining a credential. And there's also a very, very high rate of kids who not only fail to learn, but actually fail to participate and drop out of the system because they feel like it's not fun, it's not rewarding, they don't get the feedback they want. And so I'm going to go through each of these pieces, the goal, the feedback, the participation, and the rules, and see what we can do and how the technology makes a change to this. Clayton Christensen brought up these 4 goals for public education, each one of these being a disruption in his terms. As we went through the system. The first disruption was when we established public school in the first place, and the goal was to preserve democracy. We moved on to preparing everyone for vocations as the Industrial Revolution got underway. With the Sputnik moment and A Nation at Risk, the famous report, we said, oh, we're no longer competitive in the world market, we need to move ahead. And that's still a continuing concern that people have. But as of 2000, even though we haven't quite finished on the Keep America Competitive goal, we are working on this goal of eliminating poverty. And that is an audacious goal for public education, and there are a lot of people that aren't sure that we should actually do that or we should expect that of public education. But indeed, the very title, No Child Left Behind, right? We have this hope or expectation that the poverty situation in our country can be corrected through our educational systems, and that makes a huge change in what we think of the schools. When I went to high school, there was a variety of classes, a variety of opportunity, and an assumption that it was my responsibility to take advantage of the resources that were given to me. And if I didn't take advantage of those, that was my problem. That's no longer the case. the school is now expected to move every child along. And there's a critical difference there. The school is now responsible for motivation, whereas previously the parents and the home and your upbringing were responsible for that motivation, for keeping you there. The school is responsible for preventing truancy, to make sure you got into the class, but whether or not you actually learned was your responsibility. That's no longer the case. And that is a big, big difference, and we have not entirely responded to that request from society yet. How does this fit in with my role at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? We have as our overriding theme that every person deserves the chance to live a healthy and productive life. And as we look at this goal and try to apply it within the United States, education is the primary area of where we look to say, how can we help all members of society live a healthy and productive life? It's by making sure that they are educated well. So we have a goal that society has given to education. In my job, I have been assigned this goal, you could say. Is this goal shared by the students? By and large, it is. In fact, it's really interesting. There is a study that was done in 2006 about why kids drop out of school. Here are the results of that. These are the reasons that the students gave for dropping out of school. But what was really interesting to me is that 70% of those students were confident that they could have graduated, and 81% acknowledged that education was critical to their success. Despite that understanding, that adoption of the goal, they still dropped out for various reasons. So yes, indeed, the goal that we have for the students is shared by the students themselves. The problems that we have exist in other parts of the system. Let's talk about the rules. Not all the rules in a game have to actually direct towards the goal. This is really an interesting insight. So I'm not going to go through step by step of all the rules that we have in school and say, does that help us towards the goal? Nope, let's get rid of it. I mean, think of the game of golf, for example. Your goal in golf is to get your ball into the hole, right? But why in the world do we do it with a club and take multiple strokes? Because it's entertaining. The efficient way to get that ball into the cup is to pick it up, run over to the cup, and drop it in. So there are artificial obstacles that are put in our way, and in fact that increases participation in some cases when those obstacles are entertaining. Now, exactly how do you define an obstacle as entertaining or disillusioning is really tough, and I'm not going to attempt to make that distinction right now. But I just want to acknowledge that just because a rule isn't moving the student towards to graduation doesn't mean you have to eliminate it. You need to look at it more carefully than that. There are nuances to this. But let's look at one particular area of the rules. A large number of our rules within school have to do with failure. On the left, I have kind of the mantra that you get out of creative firms: fail early, fail often. This quote of "I've failed 10,000 times or found 10,000 ways that don't work" has been attributed to Thomas Edison. I don't know if he really said that, but the framework is there, right? Try and try and try. And fail and get feedback from those failures and try again. That happens in every place in society except school. In school, failure, evil, right? It's not an option. You've got an F, done. End of discussion. Maybe we need to take an examine how we deal with failure. In video games, there's this concept of a boss monster, right? I'm headed towards, I get through all these obstacles, and all of a sudden the boss monster shows up. And you've got to beat that boss monster. The first thing anybody does when they see the boss monster is save game. And then you try and you fail and you restore your game. Try, fail, restore game, and keep doing that until you get it done. The boss monster of education is a final exam. What happens when you fail your final exam? Reset back to the beginning. Game over, start over. You have to go through an entire semester of school before you can try to approach that boss monster again. That's a problem. But we do that because of this problem I talked about a minute ago, scarce assessments, right? It takes a lot of effort to compose that final exam. It takes a lot of effort to score that final exam. And once I've administered that final exam to a particular student, I can't use the same exam again. I have to create a different one. And so to prevent us from spending inordinate resources on examination, we create these huge consequences to the student that actually impair their opportunity to fail and learn from their failure. if we have abundant assessment, we can start to bypass that kind of a problem. Here's another area that video games give us something that we can learn from. I've got a whole bunch of failures. I went for the least violent failures I could come up with. Were all in car racing games, and even so, they're rather entertaining. The point in the video games is instead of making okay, you did fail, right? You just crashed the car. But they make it this epic failure. It is just so much fun to watch. Let's go crash the car again. Let's do it a bunch of times. The first thing that my kids did when they got a flight simulator is see if they could do a head-on collision between two fighter jets. And what happens, right? It's an experiment. What happens when we fail this way? We learn from these fail experiences. We've got to redefine what it means to fail in schools. And I think we can do that. I'll use one other example. When we go skiing with my kids, if I haven't failed at least 5 times that day, they just laugh at me. They say, Dad, you're not learning anymore. You're not learning to ski if you're not falling. And that's really true. You've got to ski on the edge of your ability if you're going to increase that ability. If you're on the edge of your ability, you're going to fall a few times. Permeates our entire world. Now, some of my, in fact, I've got a son who's an engineer, and I'll talk a little bit more about him later. But he says, well, what about engineering? Engineers can't fail. If engineers fail, people die, right? So how can we teach kids in school that you can get away with failure and recover from that failure if they're going to go into these fields or medicine or other places where you fail, right? Well, that's not entirely true. In fact, I'm betting that the pilot of the airliner that I flew in on yesterday probably crashed the flight simulator a bunch of times before he got in the cockpit of the real plane. If he didn't, I wish he did, because that means I know that he knows how to get out of his tailspin or a whole bunch of other crazy things that might happen up in the air. I want him to fail in that safe environment with the safety net around him. And even when they get out into the professional world, Boeing spent 3 years flight testing the 787. Why did they do that? Because they knew that the engineers, despite all of their efforts to the contrary, would still make mistakes. And they were able to discover those failures, repair them, and correct for them. We have safety nets all around us in the professional world. We can do the same thing in education and allow people to learn from failure. Okay, the next area, the next rule area that I'd like to talk about is this idea that presence equals achievement. Let's face it, it doesn't, right? This has all kinds of ramifications throughout our system. The seat time requirements, as opposed to the actually learning a competency and measuring that. It has to do with whether we're measuring attendance or completion of a particular learning objective and so on. But we proxy presence for achievement because achievement has been difficult to measure. Again, I keep coming back to it. Abundant assessment starts to help this, right? If we can directly measure achievement, then let's quit worrying so much about presence. And then we can get away from all this negative language of truancy and absence or an attendance, and we even have laws, right? Mandatory attendance laws and so on. We can worry less about that if we're measuring what we're really trying to accomplish. Final rule area that I'd like to address for a moment is this idea that the learning and the credentialing are provided by the same institution or by the same mechanism. That is a carryover from this idea of presence equals achievement. But if you unbundle the learning from the credentialing, then all kinds of interesting things start to happen. It means that the student, particularly in higher ed, but this can even happen in K-12 education, can start to seek whatever is the most efficient way of learning this objective for that individual student, and yet can get an equivalent credential through whatever means it takes to get there. And this gets into that badging stuff that Steve Midgley, who I see back there, hi Steve, Steve was talking about the Mozilla badging process and so on. If we can start to unbundle credentialing from learning, and then we get a lot more flexibility, and we free up our students and our teachers to be more creative about the learning experience. So just as a summary, just talking about the rules then, as a summary here, we've got failure consequences, we've got measures of achievement, we've got the bundling of learning and credentialing. These are places where we can apply these different kinds of technologies to adjust those rules in ways that are going to be more favorable for student learning. So We are right around halfway through the presentation, a little bit more than halfway, but we're going to take a halftime break and do a formative assessment, okay? So there are people that sell these clickers that you can use to try and get immediate feedback from your students in your class. I've come up with a new method that doesn't require technology. We're going to go low-tech today. This was invented by the village people. We've got Y, M, C, and A, right? So I'm going to give you guys a multiple choice question, and your job is, and don't be brave here, is to say Y, M, C, or A. Since this is a formative assessment, you can look around the room, see what other people answer, and change your answer as we go, okay? So everybody got your hands ready? Are we all set? Okay. What is the lowest score you expect to see on a multiple choice exam, right? 0%, Y, 25%, 50%, or 100%, right? What's the lowest score? We've got some M's and some Y's. We've got a few A's. Lowest score, the answer is 25%. Okay? All of you M's out there, you just won. Right? If you answer randomly on a multiple choice exam, you're going to get 25% because we're assuming a 4-question multiple choice exam, which is the most common form. If it's a 5-1, then you're going to get 20%. You understand how the statistics work. Okay. This leads into an interesting anecdote. My son, the same son that's an engineer, he's working on his PhD right now. He was in high school when No Child Left Behind came about, and they were doing the first year of the annual testing. Now, this first year, it turns out they were just trying to get a baseline statistic, so it wasn't actually going to be grading the schools like it would in following years. And he was complaining to me that he was going to spend a day and a half in these exams. Why do I have to do this, Dad? This is really a waste of time. And whether good or bad, I decided to tell him the truth. I said, they're not grading you, they're grading your school. And he said, oh, really? You know, he got this little gleam in his eye. I said, hey, forget that, forget that. What I found out later, much later it turns out, is that he and his buddies decided to challenge each other to see who could get the lowest score on the summative exam. And so they went in, and he tied with several of his buddies for 0. Now remember, 25% is what you expect to be the lowest score. He and his friends tied for 0. They went to considerable effort to get the lowest possible score as opposed to the lowest expected score. Now the interesting thing about this is that it was 9 months later when he returned, that was in his junior year, 9 months later when he returned to school for his senior year, he found that even though he had aced pre-calculus the previous year and intended to take calculus his senior year, he had been enrolled in remedial math. And it took actually a bunch of effort and some signed letters and various things in order to get him out of remedial math and into the calculus class that he was supposed to be in. Now, there's all kinds of problems with this. The feedback loop took 9 months, okay? It was governed on one data point, a score from 0 to 100 of how well you had done on your math exam. They didn't look at any of the other records, all the other data points that showed that, yeah, he was ready for calculus. And we could go on and on about all of this. But what this leads us into is this whole idea of feedback loops. Again, I'm going to refer back to I come from this family of engineers. My son's an engineer. My father was a mechanical engineer. My brothers are electrical and mechanical engineers. My sister's a mechanical engineer. My other sister is an environmental scientist. And so I'm only a computer scientist, right? I barely qualify as a computer scientist because we don't have to get quite as deep into the differential equations as all those engineers do, even if we do abstract algebra. So they all talk about this control theory, which actually is an embedded domain of mathematics within mechanical engineering. And in control theory, you have your reference. This is what you're trying to achieve. You have your controller that takes that reference and creates an input to your system, and you deliver an output, what's actually happening. What we're looking at right here is an open loop control system. And in order for an open loop control system to work, your system itself has to be extremely precise. Otherwise, you're not going to get a predictable output. If there's not precision in there, then that input gets distorted by the time you reach the output, and you're not going to get precision out of it. In a sense, this is what we do today. We deliver consistent input, we deliver consistent curriculum to our students, and those students theoretically are going to give us consistent output, right? But are students precise? I don't think so. And you know what? A lot of other things aren't precise too, like my hand, like my car, like other things. And so we have to have a feedback loop in the system. In almost every reliable control system has a feedback loop. So you sense the output and you create feedback, and the controller compares the reference to the feedback and adjusts the input accordingly and makes sure that we center on what we need to, right? Your cruise control senses the speed, and if you're going slower than the reference, then the input is increase the throttle speed to pick up speed. We have this all over our systems. Our own nervous system gives us feedback about where my hand is right now. Is it about eye level? Oh, no, not quite. Let me move it up a little bit. You know, I have these feedback control systems throughout all of our systems. Well, we need the same kind of feedback in the school, right? The student is the system, and students are imprecise. And by the way, we love them to be imprecise, don't we? Let's not try to get precise students. Let's enjoy the variety of them, and let's make sure that we share that variety that's coming in. But we do at least want to reach a consistent level of competency in core subjects, and then let them express their differences in all kinds of other areas. But we've got to get that baseline. So in order to do that, we have to take assessments and feed that back to the teacher, to the learning system. I put teacher here because it's really a partnership between the teacher and the learning system that the teacher is working with, and let that direct the kinds of activities that the student is working with. This is the way we need our feedback to work. And again, we're right back there to those abundant assessments. I can't say enough how much I think that is going to make a difference in our learning systems. Well, the last part of our learning that I want to talk about is voluntary participation. And as I was pondering voluntary participation, I said, what do we do about the voluntary participation piece of learning? Well, the reality is this has to do with motivation, the science of motivation. And so I started looking around. What can I learn about motivation? And quite honestly, I'm a novice to this. I was talking to a behavioral economist, there we go, a couple of days ago, and he says, yeah, this is great stuff, but there are some nuances. But I'm going to at least plant some seeds in here, and there's a lot that we can learn from it. This is mostly coming from Daniel Pink's work. How many of you are familiar with Dunker's candle problem? Okay, a few of you have seen, mostly through Dan Pink or other places. So this is a problem. You're given a box of tacks, a candle, and a book of matches, and your job is to attach the candle to the wall and light it in such a way that the wax is not going to drip on the table below. And when the subjects are brought into the room, and they're asked to solve this particular problem. They try all kinds of things. They try to tack the candle to the wall. The tacks aren't long enough to go through the candle. They try to melt wax and stick it to the wall. That doesn't work. They do all kinds of things. And it typically takes them between 5 and 10 minutes to solve this particular problem. It requires a lot of trial and error, some real thinking about how to solve this particular problem. Now, Dunker invented this in the 1930s. And Sam Glucksberg decided to play around with this in the 1960s. And he wanted to see how motivation affected people's ability to solve the candle problem. So one group of subjects were sent into the room, and they were told, we want to get a norm for how long it takes to solve this problem. So you're part of our norms group. We're just getting an average performance out of this. The other group was told, if you're in the top 25% of people to solve this problem, you're going to get $5. And if you're the best performer, you're going to get $20 or $5 for being in the top 25%, $20 to be the very best. So they have this great financial incentive. Okay, all of us economists here, who thinks that the incentivized group is going to do better than the regular group, right? Some of you have seen the video. Yeah, the incentivized group performed worse than the norm group. Then he tried this thing, the candle problem for dummies. You take the tacks out of the box and you send the people in the room. Tested the same thing, with and without incentives. And for those who haven't figured it out yet, this is the solution. You have to dump the tacks out of the box, tack it to the wall, and put the candle in. And by taking the tacks out of the box when the subject enters the room, you have changed the nature of the problem. It becomes very straightforward. Oh, okay, the box is one of my tools to solve the problem. Whereas they have to go through some trial and error with the first problem before they discover that. Well, these are the results that Glucksberg was able to tabulate. Those who received a financial incentive to solve the problem had their attention focused so hard on trying to solve it quickly that they performed 3.5 minutes worse on average than those with no incentive. On the other hand, for the easy problem, the simplified problem, the incentives worked the same way that we wanted to. A whole bunch of research was kicked off by this effort, and there was a big study, kind of a meta-study that was done by, of all groups, the Federal Reserve. And the conclusion of this study was, as long as the task involved only mechanical skill, bonuses worked as they would be expected. The higher the pay, the better the performance. But once the task called for even rudimentary cognitive skill, a larger reward led to poorer performance. Now, there's a bunch of other work that's shown that your reward needs to reach a certain baseline. No reward doesn't work either. People don't want to starve. But once you reach a certain baseline, motivation for these kinds of material rewards doesn't seem to make a difference. And they actually distinguish between extrinsic rewards, something that has nothing to do with the task, and intrinsic rewards, rewards that are inherent to the nature of the task. This is really important because both teaching and learning are cognitively demanding tasks. And our reward system, if it's focused strictly on monetary or material rewards, extrinsic to the nature of teaching and learning, aren't going to accomplish what we need to do. And one thing I might add to that, reflecting back onto this whole idea of having presence proxy for performance or achievement, is that keeping kids in class, making them present, is a mechanical task. It's the kind that these rewards work for, but actually learning is not. So that proxy becomes problematic because we actually might measure success if we're using a proxy for achievement, whereas if we're measuring actual achievement, we might see something differently. I don't have any rigorous studies that say that, but I raise that as a potential problem. So Daniel Pink has come up with 3 intrinsic motivators that work on these cognitive challenges. They are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I want to look at how we can approach each of these intrinsic motivators in the context of school. The first one is that students are invested in the outcome when they choose the activity. There's some really interesting results that came out of this idea of learning styles. You've probably heard of the learning styles theory, where if we can match the teaching style to the individual student's learning style, then they perform better. Mixed results actually from the studies on that, whether or not that theory works, some better than others. But what's interesting about this is if you give a set of activities to the student and allow the student to choose which activity, then it's almost like the placebo effect. They are invested in the outcome of that learning activity because they chose it. They want it to be successful. And so regardless of whether they chose the optimum activity, their performance improves when they are given autonomy in the choice of the activities they're going to be involved in. This gets back into the learning maps concept of letting the kids be invested in this process. It gets into offering them a choice of activities, a choice of approaches or strategies for studying, and acknowledging that we don't need an AI system to prescribe the next learning activity for the student. Why should we have an AI on the computer prescribe decisions when the student has real intelligence to make certain decisions? What we need to be thinking about is informing those decisions as opposed to prescribing those decisions. And that's a subtle difference between informing and prescribing, but it makes a world of difference in terms of the autonomy and the engagement of the student in what they're doing. The next area is this idea of mastery. Again, back to the candle problem, these extrinsic incentives that aren't inherent to the task may impede achievement. So we need to be looking at incentives that are inherent in that, and mastery is a key part of that. So you can think of the badging issue concept of the badges are an acknowledgement that you have mastered a particular problem. It also gets really interesting in terms of the design of learning games themselves, not the game of school that I'm talking about, but these games that we use as exercises to help the student learn. as much as possible, those games need to be designed so that the subject being learned is inherent in the mechanics of the game, rather than it being an extrinsic thing, right? It's not as effective to run up to the dragon with my sword and he's got a times table problem, and if I can get the answer to the times table right, I get extra sword strokes, right? I've seen lots of games designed that way. They work, they're okay, but wouldn't it be better if the multiplication problem was inherent in the mechanics of the game itself? That does a whole bunch of things. The rewards are actually aligned with the knowledge itself. They start to help me think about applications. They help the mathematical thinking, not just the procedure of learning the multiplication, all kinds of stuff. So the best learning games are those that incorporate the subject into the structure of the game itself. And this actually borders on the next area, which I call cognitive scaffolding. And this is the whole idea of bringing purpose. These three parts of the motivation are really overlapping. You can come up with single solutions that address multiple parts of that. And if you are trying to bring purpose to the subject of learning, you need to teach the student how does this concept apply. There's some work being done by psychologists to try and figure out why we have this continuing achievement gap, even among students who go to the same class, to the same school, have the same teacher. Why do we have these achievement gaps? One key part of this is what happens when the students return home from school and say, why do I have to learn my times tables, Mom? Why do I have to learn factor polynomials? Who cares which country Genghis Khan conquered? The middle class parents, the college educated parents, which is one of the big predictors of achievement in school, right, is the education attainment of the parent, they're able to answer those questions. They can show them applications of this. Our at-risk students, the ones that we care most passionately about at the Gates Foundation, return home to a parent who's unable to answer those questions, or who may actually be out working, and they're going home wondering, but instead watch TV. We can scaffold this learning. Creating a cognitive scaffold is the application of the concepts that we're learning at school. We can actually address that in schools. One particular area that this is done, and I'm going to feature Atlantis Remixed here, but there are a lot of other games like this. One area that this is done is these multi-user virtual environments. These multiplayer games where you get in and you're working on a problem. These are real-world problems created in a simulated world. And students play roles. You're the campaign manager for a mayor. You are a environmental scientist trying to figure out why the fish are dying in the lake. You are an engineer working on a problem, and you apply the skills that you're learning in your regular class, the mathematics, the language arts, and so forth. Atlantis Remixed actually has the students go through an inquiry process to collect information, and it helps them understand how to organize that information, ultimately creating a persuasive essay explaining what they learned and persuading somebody to do something about the problem that they discovered. This creates that scaffold and establishes a purpose for the things that the students are learning. The learning maps, likewise, can start to establish a purpose more from the area of saying, I've got a pathway through here, and that pathway ultimately gets into a productive career that's going to make a difference for society, and it involves all of these different kinds of knowledge. Just in summary, to apply technology to motivation, I've kind of mentioned all this before, but we've got autonomy, mastery, and purpose, and we can take these personalized learning systems, this rich feedback, these multi-user virtual environments, and start to address those things within the context of school. A lot of this is being done already in classes. I read an essay recently from a second-generation teacher who is just retiring, and he talked about how engaged his mother was as a teacher, how engaged he was, the activities that they went through in order to create meaning and context for the subjects they're teaching. and to measure the student's progress on a daily basis and so forth. But the thing that really jumped out to me on this essay was how exhausted he was. In his very first line, he talked about how exhausted his mother was when she came home from school, and he couldn't figure out why teaching would be so exhausting. Then when he took up the profession itself, he found the same thing. I don't think that we can rely on the principle of exhausted teachers to achieve the goals that we want to. Yes, I applaud the teachers who are willing to engage at that level, but we can't expect that. We have got to give them the support so that they can do the things that these exhausted teachers are doing without exhausting every one of them. That's just an unreasonable expectation, in my opinion. Just to wrap up, and I think we're going to have a few minutes, well, we'll have only a few minutes for some questions and answers, and I'm happy to take them afterwards as well. The game of school has been designed to maximize the utility of scarce resources. Let's face it, that is a lot of the reason for the structure of the existing game of school. But properly applied, we can bring in abundance where that scarcity was once ruling. Well, you won't have abundance everywhere. Teacher time is going to remain a scarce resource. But we can maximize the use of those scarce resources by applying abundance in other parts of the learning system. In order to achieve the potential of this abundance, we do need to change the structure of the game of school. Here are some references, resources, and I've got probably about 3 or 4 minutes to take some questions. Yes?
This presentation is very student-centric.
Uh-huh.
And given the last part of it where you're talking about motivation and it's very much focused on the child and how he approaches this whole thing, I'm wondering why in your control theory loop you don't connect the assessment to the child.
Uh-huh.
You connect it only to the teacher.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. For the sake of the recording, the question is why in my feedback loop did I send the feedback back to the teacher instead of the student? It's actually, I was using the teacher as a proxy for the entire learning system. So in many cases, for example, in an online adaptive learning system, that feedback it does need to go to the teacher, but in many cases it passes through the system and comes directly to the student within the moment or second that they're doing the exercises. I do believe that there needs to be a little bit of interpretation that occurs. So instead of just saying, you got the question right or wrong, that's really a minimal level of feedback. You got the question wrong, and this is why, and this is what you can do in order to learn, to understand that better. And we can do that. So yes, I believe very much in feeding back directly to the student as much as possible, but try to do that with some context around that feedback. Great question. Thank you. Yes?
When will the learning maps become available?
We are going to be announcing, there's a project that I didn't really spend any time on here called the Shared Learning Consortium. There's a website that's going to go live, Shared Learning Collaborative. The name's changed a couple times. The Shared Learning Collaborative is going to be announced, well, it has been announced. The website will go live in about 30 days, and it'll have some timelines for a lot of work. The learning maps being part of that. We anticipate that it'll be ready for application vendors to start playing around with the code sometime in the spring of 2012, so within about 4 or 5 months. And the code will be complete in the summer of this coming year. Other questions? Great. Well, we're out of time. So thank you, guys. I appreciate it.